The 411 Live.
Where you can learn about issues that affect us every day. State of world, 411 Live.
Real people, real talk.
Made to help people in our community in every way. For your girl, 411 Live.
It has been an agonizing few weeks. Not only are we dealing with COVID-19, with our mask and our social distancing, and for some, we're losing loved ones. But recently, our thought process has made a 180-degree turn with the killing of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer. The impact of that incident has been astonishing. Hello, everyone. This is the 411 Live, Real People, Real Talk. I'm Beverly Taylor. I have two very important guests with me that I'm very excited about. My guests are former U.S. Attorney James Santelle, now in private practice, and attorney Lynnette McNeely, and she is the chair of legal redress for the NAACP, Wisconsin State Conference of Branches. Welcome to both of you. They're muted, so that's why you didn't hear from them, but that's okay. I have to tell you guys, when I saw the Minneapolis police officer driving his knee into the neck of George Floyd being handcuffed with his hands behind him, in a prone stance on the ground, the officer just so casually kneeing him, I felt sadness. I felt horror, and I felt very, very angry. It was difficult to watch because it seemed like it lasted so long. 8 minutes, 46 seconds seemed like a lifetime. And this man gasping for air and saying, "I can't breathe." Difficult to watch. So I'm going to start out with, what was your reaction?
Thank you so much for having me. And it's a privilege to be able to talk about these topics, which is why I work with the NAACP, and I have so for about 14 years. When I saw that video of George Floyd, I have to admit, as a criminal or prior criminal defense attorney, someone who works in advocacy, it was a lot of the same. So there was sadness. It's gut-wrenching every time. Mm-hmm. But we've seen so much of this, especially since the election of Obama. It seems as if police killings have really gone on the uptick. We've also seen some other exacerbating factors in communities that are causing unrest just in conveniences of living. So there's been a decline in that regard too. So I saw the culmination happen with that incident with George Floyd. People who are trying to do the right things and play by the rules and feeling that they're being targeted, and a collective of people who believe that they have the right to target. And so that's how I felt when I saw that happen.
Yeah.
It was gut-wrenching. But to be honest, since the event, I'm pretty impressed as to where we may be going with this.
All right, and we will talk about that. Jim, what was your initial reaction?
Much the same as a human being, as you and Lynnette have also said. It is gut-wrenching. It is emotionally horrifying to watch that. I bring to this, as Lynnette does, some background in the criminal law and criminal procedure as a prosecutor for 30 years. And my responses in that category, in addition to those highly emotional, and I would offer to you appropriate responses, are two. One is you were quite literally witnessing the violation of George Floyd's constitutional right to life. And I think we need to underscore that notion that every single human being in our nation, I would argue on the face of the planet, has a human right, of course, to life, but certainly in our country, we have placed at the highest level this notion that we have constitutional rights, among them the right to life. And we saw that being deprived of George Floyd, as we have in other instances, in that moment, in that 8 minutes and 46 seconds before that and beyond. Second, much wedded to that, we also saw the very worst in law enforcement, period. And I say that as somebody who worked with law enforcement sitting next to me at the table, prosecuting cases for 30 years. That was the very worst of law enforcement. And so from the very start, what I saw was, again, this combination of emotion, the deprivation of constitutional rights, and I called it from the very start a murder. Even though, again, in the prosecution area, we make the allegation of murder, we were witnessing a murder of George Floyd, a murder of one of our fellow citizens, and a murder being conducted, being perpetrated by someone who is supposed to serve us and help us and provide us with safety and security along with the other three. It was nothing short of an horrific event for all of those reasons.
Right. Derek Chauvin, the officer who was kneeling on Floyd's neck, has been charged with second-degree murder, second-degree manslaughter, while the other three officers have been charged with aiding and abetting murder and manslaughter. People looking at that video, you know, there's this sense of, well, it's an open and shut case. But as a prosecutor, there are thresholds that you have to meet, right, with second-degree murder. So it's not, not just it's not an open, you can't say open and shut, correct? What's the burden of proof?
Sure. So this is a terrific question. It's so good to be together with you and Lynnette talking about these kinds of things, because I think it helps to animate the discussion. Obviously, second-degree murder, intentionally killing the victim without premeditation. It carries with it a 40-year possible prison term. Aiding and abetting basically means assisting, supporting, doing something to advance that fundamental crime. So the concern that is raised here whenever you are charging at that level, which again is just below the first-degree murder charge, is I need to show that Derek Chauvin and the others as aiders and abettors had the intent to kill, admittedly without premeditation. That is, he didn't go even 10 minutes earlier. He may have intended to kill George Floyd. There was not that premeditation sense, but in that moment, he intended to commit the crime of murder. In his brain, in his psyche, I am intending to kill you, George Floyd. That is a high burden because we need to convince as prosecutors a jury of 12 people beyond a reasonable doubt that that man had in his mind that intent to kill in that time. Now, having said that, that is a very high standard, but it's one where I believe strongly that in this case, that can be met. And so I support entirely that charge, that increase from the previous third-degree murder charge. This charge, why? Again, many reasons that Lynnette and I can chat about, but among them, you identified it already, 8 minutes and 46 seconds. If I was prosecuting this case, I would actually have the jury pause, if the judge would let me do it, for 46 seconds, and have them consume that notion that this is the long period of time that George Floyd was being killed with Chauvin's knee on his neck, right?
Yeah, to bring the jury, the courtroom, the judge into that moment. But as Jim is explaining, that this is about intent, and intent has to be proven. And that's what he means by a high bar. You know, what evidence can we bring in to prove that there was an intent to kill at some point? Now, there's evidence that he was attempting to detain, attempting to control, attempting to quell, and now attempting to kill. So they'd have to go through to get straight to that meat in the case.
Well, I'm thinking that one thing that might help with that is, I think you talk about 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and what I've read is like the last 3 minutes, he was out, but the guy's knee was still there. So that may help the case.
Hugely compelling. Again, as Lynnette and I are saying, this time period is hugely persuasive, I think, in establishing it. If you think about anything that you do, especially in connection with another human being, I can make a mistake and do something in 2 seconds that could have a catastrophic impact upon you or upon physical items, that sort of thing. And in that instance, I may not have had the intent to do that horrific thing because it lasted such a small period of time. Here, this is such a long period of time. He had to have a time to contemplate what was going on here. And Beverly, to your earlier points, let's not forget, this was, and I think you make the compelling argument as a prosecutor of this police officer, George Floyd You did not have to bring him into custody anymore, into control, right? He was on the ground. He was handcuffed. There were two other officers behind him. That argument goes away after maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute tops.
Yeah.
This is no longer a situation where that will be the defense, I have no doubt. But is that a compelling defense? And can you convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt to reject that defense? I think you can.
The other thing, too, is people will have to be patient with this case because it's not like it's unless this guy pleads guilty and they accept this plea, this may take a while.
It certainly will. Lynnette will speak about this also. We have this notion of a speedy trial in America. In the federal system and the state system, there's a notion that every defendant appropriately under the Constitution has the right to a speedy trial in addition to their peers and all the other protections. And there's a presumption, I should say. There is a presumption of innocence. So all of us will embrace that for all of these officers going in, innocent until proven guilty. But that's the other piece of it. Lynnette can speak to this perhaps even better than I can. The notion that this is going to be a trial that will be conducted this year, probably unlikely. I don't practice in Minnesota, but my guess is there are going to be huge numbers of pretrial motions to dismiss, evidentiary motions about what's going to be presented. Right. And I would guess, Lynnette, probably sometime maybe in 2021, there will be a trial here, maybe. Would you agree with me on that?
Maybe, and it just depends on the prosecutor and the evidence, the times. There's so many potential defendants here. I mean, separating the defendants, identifying their independent interests, and timing that the defense attorneys want to have strategically in order to sufficiently defend their client, have enough time to review all evidence, all possible defenses. They may take some time. And so you never know. But as Jim has said, you do have a right to a speedy trial. So you could, what is the saying? The process is slow unless it's quick.
To that point, too, I think Lynnette makes a very good point. The other things that were part of the initial complaint here, we recall that there were at least 2 autopsies done, and they came pretty much to the same conclusion. But the forensics piece of this, which has kind of waned in the media's attention, and the whole issue, we're going to get experts, right, Lynnette, who are going to testify about what caused his death. Well, there'll be experts who are going to come in who are going to talk about his physical condition. There was, these references in the initial complaint about other causes, and that's going to be part of this. That's forensics, that's medical people coming in and testifying about what they have found. And that is time consuming, and it's in the weeds also in an evidentiary basis.
Yeah. And ironically, he had coronavirus, of all things.
Oh, this George Floyd.
Yes.
Yeah, which may have caused some complications with his breathing, and that there's an argument there.
Yeah.
I do have it's interesting about the elements of the crimes that are being charged or could be charged in these cases. But I was hoping that Jim would speak to the element of qualified immunity and how does that play in these types of cases? Because even if you have intent and that's proven and all the other elements proven, how does qualified immunity come into all of this?
Sure, that's a terrific question, and it's one of those issues that, again, so wonderful to talk to the two of you about this, because even in the passage by the House a day or so ago, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, there is plainly a significant provision that changes that application when it comes to the concept itself. And up to now, there's a case to get wonkish with you, Beverly, and Lynnette will join me as a law school professor for just a moment. There's called Harlow versus Fitzgerald, and says basically this: government damage, government officials performing discretionary functions, that includes law enforcement, generally are shielded from liability for civil damages. Again, this is not a criminal lawsuit. This would be a civil action brought either by the state or by the family. And here's the important language that that's getting at: as their conduct if their conduct does not violate clearly established statutory or constitutional rights of which a reasonable person would have known. Let me say that again: conduct which would not violate a clearly established statutory or constitutional right of which a reasonable person would have known. And the concern is that there's another case called Malay versus Briggs, which the Supreme Court said it provides protection to all but the plainly incompetent or those who knowingly violate the law. And that's a pretty good summary of it. It's a broad standard. And there's an awful lot of feeling that it does protect law enforcement in a significant way. And so there's
Did you explain that? Are you distinguishing that as a civil cause of action?
exactly right. And this is different. And that's a very important point, that this is not a part of the criminal prosecution. This would be a separate civil action. And again, in my work with the Department of Justice, we played around this with this both and worked with it on the prosecution and defensive side civilly. And the important notion there is, as I get back to George Floyd, or I think about others like Walter Scott or Eric Gardner, I look at those situations again, a chokehold, being shot in the back, and say, okay, would qualified immunity protect those officers? And I come to the conclusion that it would not. And there would not be a circumstance, again, not to say that a defense attorney representing those officers in a civil lawsuit would not raise it. But if I were the judge, would I say, yes, if you're shooting an unarmed man who's running away from you in the back, if you're chokeholding Eric Gardner, if the knee is on the neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, you have to know that there is a clearly established constitutional right to life and that your conduct was not reasonable under those circumstances. And so while the notion of qualified immunity is broad, in these instances, again, my immediate response is, I don't think it would even be a defense to this conduct. It is so outrageous.
For a civil case. So we see, with these other cases, especially in Ferguson and other police shootings that have occurred, grand juries have reviewed the evidence, have reviewed the scenarios and facts, and they've come to conclusions that have mind-boggled a lot of us as citizens. Can you help us understand how is a jury able to see an officer shoot a citizen in the back and come up to their dead body or bleeding body and kick them in the head and still find a grand jury that absolves them of any accountability?
Right. It is a stunning head scratcher, right? And I don't mean to make light of it because it is stunning. With respect to the grand jury, and it's another great avenue of discussion here, and it does go back to the charges and the element of proof. In the federal system, and it's also very relevant what's going on in Congress today, there is a statute called Section 242 that does, in fact, make it a federal criminal civil rights violation to engage in this kind of conduct. And the language is that, again, this is responsive to your question, Lynnette, and it says, under color of law, that means basically you're a police officer if you're doing something. If you willfully subject any person to the deprivation of right, in this case, life, right? Security protected by the Constitution, life. You are in violation of federal law. And interestingly, on the federal statute, this is, again, not the statute under which Chauvin and the others were prosecuted, but the federal statute, it doesn't require animus based upon race. So I do not have to prove as a federal prosecutor that Derek Chauvin was motivated by the fact that he hates Black people if he did. I don't know that. I have no idea. I don't have to even prove that. What I do have to prove, and this is why Nette's question is so good and so very focused, is I do have to prove under that federal statute, beyond a reasonable doubt, again, to a majority of grand jurors and then to a pettit jury also, to, again, a unanimous trial jury, a specific intent to deprive the victim of his right to life. In other words, getting back to our earlier discussion, Beverly, it basically incorporates that same state charge. I've got to show to a grand jury and I've got to show to a trial jury that in this action, that police officer acting under color of law had the specifically intended to bring about the particular deprivation, intended basically to kill.
Right.
That is, again, I would maintain in these cases, that would not be difficult for Lynnette or me to show if we were doing this prosecution. In others, I think that is the challenge of prosecution. I've confronted this. I've talked to families in my own office when I was U.S. attorney and explained how difficult that is, and to show why, because you're asking the jury to get inside the mind of a police officer and say, not I would not say, not in the Walter Scott case, not in Eric Gardner, not in this case, but in others where the evidence, where you may not have tape, you may not have other strong evidence to say with certainty, beyond a reasonable doubt, probably, that officer intended to kill that person, as opposed to, as Lynnette said before, intended to detain, intended to stop, intended to those kinds of things. And although this sounds like very wonkish lawyer stuff that Lynnette are describing here, that can be a tough burden. And the point, I'll bring this to somewhat of a close, the point of what the House passed yesterday, this George Floyd Justice and is to change that standard, which we have been advocating for in the Obama administration for years, and basically changing it so that we're changing from that willful standard to knowing or reckless. That, again, lawyers can play with. That is a huge change. It lowers the bar and it makes the standard of proof much lower.
All right.
That's a good thing.
We're going to talk more about that piece of legislation later on, but we're going to take a break right now. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the protests that we've been seeing. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
My God.
It's another sad day in America.
Painful to be introduced to George Floyd during his last breath.
With the cop's knee on his neck. He deserved so much more.
How many black lives have to be taken before something is done?
We are not a threat.
I am shaking as I type.
This has got to stop.
We are sick of it.
We need conviction.
I just want us all to live.
The deaths will not stop until the powers that be are finally held accountable.
Don't look away from the truth until every one of us are free from white supremacy.
The world stands with you.
Criminalizing and killing of black and brown bodies is not new. It's as old as America. It's just getting filmed more.
Do you know what it feels like to be hunted? To have a new hashtag for a dead black person every single day? How does one plan a life if they aren't sure they will have a life to plan?
Deborah Dan,
Nina Pop, Stephen Clark, Nia Wilson,
Keisha Mike,
Christopher Dion,
George Floyd. His name was George Floyd. Say his name.
Say his name.
George Floyd. Say his name.
Say their names. Once again and always, we fight for justice. Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter.
Rest in power, beautiful.
Go to blacklivesmatter.com.
And welcome back to the 411 Live. Real people, real talk. We are talking to attorneys James Santelle and attorney Lynnette McNeely. And we're talking about the immediate impact from the George Floyd killing and the potential future impact. Going to the immediate impact, the protests. Protests here, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Chicago, all across the country. But amazingly, protests in other countries as well. And you're seeing them holding up signs saying Black Lives Matter. Now, we have had killings at the hands of police officers before, but this one seems different. Why do you, I have my theories, but why do you think it is? Lynnette, I think I see you're kind of moving that hand up.
I'll let Jim go first. Yeah, go ahead. I'd love the dialogue. I'd love to know what your opinion is on why do you think this has hit a global level?
Well, it is again an issue, a question for us to ponder almost sociologically, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the sad and even desperate part of the question is, why did it take so long, right? That's what's really backed into your question, right, Beverly?
Yeah.
I don't have a good sociological answer for why it is, because I will tell you, again, we spoke already about Walter Scott. This was back in 2015. This is a man who was stopped for a tail light, right? Once again, the story very well. And the officer gets him out. Things devolved badly. And then we had this videotape of Walter Scott running across the park. And the officer, again, as I said before, shooting him in the back. Now, the only, I am going to say positive or good thing, that's even a terrific way to describe it, but the result of that, you should know, is that, yes, the U.S. Department of Justice under the Obama administration, which I was a part of, did in fact prosecute that officer under that Title 18 Civil Rights statute, and that officer is spending 20 years in jail.
Right.
So we saw that then, but it did not produce, even with that prosecution and that horrific videotape, it did not produce the result. Protests, yes, but did not at this level. You know, Eric Gardner, the other one we're talking about, we have videotape. We see that picture of his being chokeholded to death. And what was Eric Gardner's offense? His offense was selling cigarettes with the proper ATF stamp on them, right? And again, a public notoriety, sure, but we did not have this sense of, as you said, Beverly, international outrage about this. And I'm certainly inclined, like many of other people, to say, okay, at some point, our, I don't want to say our tolerance level, but our sense of this building up just became too much, and we began to take a true inventory. We looked back upon ourselves and into ourselves as a nation and said, this has just gone too far. And yet, I will tell you, I am individually, as someone who's involved in this for a long period of time, I was frustrated 5 and 10 years ago when we did not have this national uprising that prompted finally Congress to take some action and law enforcement entities around the country to do something. I don't know what the answer is to that. I'm certainly pleased that we're having these kinds of discussions and moving in the right direction to make these changes. And I wish desperately that we did not have to call this legislation the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. I would love to, frankly, I don't mean this with any disrespect, never to have known who George Floyd is, right? A country of 326 million people. On behalf of all of those people who died before, it is coming now. I'm concerned again that maybe the best answer is, for whatever reason it did not happen before, let us not let this fall aside again, as we've done again with gun violence and other issues in this country. It doesn't necessarily have to be at this extreme height that it is, because we have gotten the attention of people. But let's make certain that we continue to advocate in local law enforcement, federal law enforcement, for these changes, legislative changes. Let's push for the actions to go forward. Maybe that's not knowing why this is happening now. Let's embrace the fact that we do have this impetus and make certain it doesn't die in 6 months, and that in 2022 we saw, remember back in the spring and summer.
That is the thing, isn't it? That it doesn't die, that it goes somewhere. Yeah, absolutely. Lynnette, why do you think it is?
I've thought about this question a little bit, and I'm not sure, but we have to remember that this is a different time, and that we have a pandemic that of epic proportions, right? For the first time in history, or a long time at least, we've shut down everything. Just as we've taken this quarantining to clean out our homes, we're also cleaning out some of these issues that have been lagging along, kind of hanging on in our society too, if you think about it. Why is this an international thing? I'm not sure, but these concerns of inequity and abuse by people in power might just be a global issue. We all have the conversation on the 1% or the 0.1% and their wealth compared to the rest of the 99% in America. But we're also, if you stay on the national news, you heard the same statistics, the same percentages globally. So maybe this is a shout out for all of us who've been in pain. We've been too busy and distracted to rise up and say something about it. We have the time now. We're cleaning house. And so this is the time to not only clean our house, but then see that so other people agree.
Right.
And then that gives you the courage and the momentum to actually get out there and speak up. Now, I will say that, to Jim's point, this has been a concern of Americans for decades, maybe centuries, right? And there has been a fight, which is why we're seeing in just a short amount of time, not only the protests, but an organized recommendation for results, right? We can pull to that history, those historical actors, those people who never gave up the fight, and pull in what they've been recommending and tweaking it for our current time. And I'm seeing that happen more often than not today too. So this has been building up. It's finally, we've had the privilege of being able to talk about it. We don't have a baseball game to take our kids to. We don't have an NBA playoffs to watch. In fact, they're on our side on this, right? So,
right. And that's kind of my theory too. We were at a pause here in this country, but in all of these countries, everybody's dealing with the pandemic. Things are closed off everywhere. And of course, there's social media, and everybody's looking at their phones, looking at their social media, and they're seeing this video of this man saying, "I can't breathe," over and over and over. And all of these things, now we have time to think about them. We have time to ask questions within ourselves. So I think that probably helped to intensify the protest, people willing to speak out. I think it's just a lot of things just coming together at the right time, which is, not exactly, I mean, a man died, so it's never a right time for that. But just these elements, people are able to concentrate. And then, of course, they're looking at TV. And if you look at, CNN, MEC, Fox, whatever, it's inundated with George Floyd and what has happened to him. So I think that has propelled all of this, and it's a good thing. And like you, I'm hoping that it goes somewhere. I'm hoping that, once there's a vaccine, and everybody's out and about, that this is all history. Hopefully that is not what will happen with all of this.
We're going to have to rebuild, I think, very intensely after we reopen society. We're hearing that whole industries might not exist, because they're waiting right now with having no customers, not being able to ramp up their their sales in this time. And not every business is able to operate in that space, especially with all the leverage debt we've seen historically.
Right.
You don't build a brand new McDonald's without a lot of debt that you got to, pay back. And you were counting on those customer foot traffic numbers to really pay that back. And now you don't have it.
Right.
So we're going to see a lot of reduction, but that means it's an opportunity for all of us. You don't have the luxury of ignoring each other. We have to work together.
Absolutely.
And so that could be another piece of motivation that continues the dialogue and helps to right some of these wrongs.
Let me go back to the protest a little bit. And Lynnette, you tell me, how much you can talk about or whatever. You were dealing with legal redress for the NAACP, and we had the protest. How is all this affecting you?
Yeah, there's a commitment to these issues and a historical concern that cannot be denied with regard to the state NAACP as well as the national. However, we are a organization that's been around in Waukesha at least since 1984, but as a national organization since 1909. And so there's protocol that we have to follow. There's also concerns when it comes to protests for the safety of the protestors, right? There's a COVID-19 virus lurking, and there's social distancing rules, and those are a little bit more difficult to manage when we're grouping together. So actually having a stand on where protesting, the NAACP Nationals has given us, is asking us to work with them before we go out there and participate as an organization. However, our members have been participating in marches all throughout every day. We are giving them guidance on knowing their rights, and we're providing, along with the ACLU, using some of the information that they're providing to the protesters. We're letting people know what to do when they're approached by cops, and letting them know how to mitigate the situation. We are speaking to our youth. We have a youth and college division that has a lot of questions about protests and a lot of questions about sharing information on Facebook. So they're keeping us busy so that we can keep them informed. But our position right now is to support our members if they elect to go out and protest. We are waiting for communication from nationals to get the okay to actually collect our own march. But in the meantime, staying alert to the needs of our members and what they might need in this time to exercise their constitutional rights.
Okay, very good. I have heard that at the early part of the the protests, because this incident with George Floyd happened May 25th. I understand that an aircraft flew over the protests. I understand that, and this is, of course, this is what I've been told. And the aircraft was possibly FBI taking pictures, surveillance of the crowd, getting those pictures, looking for people who were possibly on probation, who had warrants out for them, using that to eventually get these people, detain these people. Don't know if this is all true, all factual, but I do know that it is possible. And I guess I'm directing this question to you, since you're a former U.S. attorney. Is this something, is this a normal practice?
It's a terrific question, Beverly, and I think you set it up very well. There certainly is more than just a little bit of reporting out there on this, right? That maybe the FBI, maybe the National Guard. The one that I see with some commonality is that the Customs and Border Patrol group, normally on our border, they're called CBP, either using drones or planes to fly over Minneapolis and San Antonio and Detroit, other places exactly as you've described. I have two thoughts on that. Again, depending upon how the specific facts of this come out, we may refine this somewhat. But number one, to the extent that the federal government, state government is interested in pursuing, trying to identify fugitives, outstanding warrants, as you say, in the federal government, there's a system for that. So the U.S. Marshal Service, and they conduct, that's part of their fundamental commission, in addition to keeping judges and others safe and secure, doing other things in the courthouses. They're responsible for doing that. And I would like to think that they're effective. Do a lot of this on the ground. A lot of it is quite literally talking to people, finding out where things are. And that's an effective process for doing this. And so when I see a CBP or perhaps other planes, if this is in fact what's going on, it appears to be there's some credibility to that. I see a disconnect there. That's not the part of the world that I understood. And I am concerned, not only as a former Department of Justice employee, but also as American, that we're using these equipment, these aircraft that do have a legitimate domestic purpose to do what? At least perhaps in part to chill the rights of Americans to exercise their First Amendment rights, to assemble, to speak. And to the extent that we are simply flying overhead hundreds, if not thousands of people, taking pictures of them, that does have a chilling effect. That does have this impact that is more than just a law enforcement purpose. And I'm very concerned about that. I would be interested in knowing more about this. Secondarily, as I said, if there is a legitimate law enforcement purpose to that, let's get that assigned to the right position, the right spot in our government. And if there has been some apprehension of someone who is truly a threat to our domestic tranquility and our safety and security, that I think we would all embrace. I'm concerned about the mechanism. I'm concerned about the overbreadth of this. And as I said, if we are using those technical trappings, if you will, of other law enforcement to have this impact upon our basic constitutional rights, the great majority, overwhelming majority of people who are out there on the streets and advocating, I have to believe, do not have warrants and are not a threat to the safety and security of our country. That disconnect concerns me profoundly.
Yeah, absolutely. We are all.
I'll add really quickly, though, warrants can be for state criminal charge or for municipal charges. So there's different types of warrants that would potentially allow for an individual to be arrested on the spot. That would, if they exist, that individual, when they encounter a police officer, may be eligible for an arrest at that moment. And so it is concerning from a state criminal charge as an individual who has a warrant for a state crime. That's one thing. But in Milwaukee, we're finding a lot of people have municipal warrants, and those are for parking tickets. Those aren't necessarily for high crimes. Or would that make the individual a danger? But yet they'd still be caught in a situation where they could be arrested.
So a warrant is a warrant, huh?
Mm.
From a parking ticket to actual criminal warrant. Yeah. Wow. Okay. I want to, with the two of you, talk about the future, the potential future impact of all of this, solutions, police reform, those kind of things. But we ran out of time. So we will have to do a part 2. So we're going to close this one out. My guests, of course, I thank you very much for being with me for this one. You guys will stay put, and we'll do a part 2. Attorney James Santelle and Attorney Lynnette McNeely. We have, like I said, we have a lot to talk about, but I think getting into kind of the solution, pushing this thing forward, where are we headed? What are we going to do? What is that possibly going to look like? I look forward to that discussion. So for you, our listeners, our viewers, thank you for joining us for this edition of the 411 Live, Real People, Real Talk, and join us again next week for the second part. You don't want to miss that. We are on all social media podcast platforms. You can find us on the platform that you really like to use. You can also find previous podcasts at youtube.com. And of course, we're going to put all of the platforms down here so you will know. Also, if you are so inclined and you would like to sponsor some of our content, you can do that. Just go to the 411live.org and you can find all of the information. For now, this is the 411 Live. Real People, Real Talk. I'm Beverly Taylor. See you next time.